Welcome to Beneath the Bible, where we're helping you dig deeper and uncover the world beneath the sacred book. With Halloween around the corner, we're spending a few weeks talking about demons and the supernatural in ancient Israel and the ancient world. Today we're going to look at a figure named Lilith. Now this figure is only mentioned by name once in the entire Bible, and the meaning of this word in its context isn't entirely clear. Now, nevertheless, this is a figure about whom long and varied traditions have developed over the centuries, and who's still familiar to many people today. Let's take a look at the origins of Lilith and how this figure evolved into the multidimensional character we know today. The figure of Lilith shows up in the Bible in only one place. The word is what's called a hapax legomena, which is just a fancy way of saying that the word only appears once in the Bible. In this case, Lilith appears in Isaiah 34:14. It says, "The desert creatures will meet with the wolves. The goat also will cry to its kind. Yes, the night bird will settle there and will find herself a resting place." Did you catch it? Now, that was the New American Standard translation of the text. It's one of the more literal translations. Now look at the Revised Standard Version, an older translation here on the left, and the NIV, a balanced translation, on the right. You'll notice there are quite a few differences between these translations. Now, this isn't because the original Hebrew is different, but it's because it's not clear what some of these words mean, or at least what they mean in this passage. Lilith, the figure we're talking about, is the word translated night bird in the NASB, night hag in the RSV, and night creatures in the NIV. Now, the actual Hebrew is this word, Lilith. Now, you can kind of tell that scholars have different opinions on how to handle this word. There are generally two schools of thought. One is that Lilith is a real desert-dwelling animal, likely a bird. It may be a type of bird called a nightjar or possibly a screech owl. The other school of thought is that this word refers to a supernatural entity that manifests as a female night demon. Now, if you want to read Lilith as a kind of bird, that's reasonable. You're in good company. Judit Blair argues that Lilith and several other characters often identified as supernatural forces or demons are in fact misidentified as such. She argues that throughout the passage in Isaiah 34, the creatures mentioned could all be identified as real-life desert-dwelling animals. There's no need to look to supernatural forces for an explanation. Now, she also makes a good point that when identifying creatures, particularly in the Old Testament, it isn't always clear what specific creature is being referenced. And because of this ambiguity, you'll see translations of Isaiah 34:14 use other kinds of animals in the first line of the verse, like hyena, jackal, or wolf. It's all the same word, ayim. And it's clear that this animal is an ominous scavenger, a kind of nocturnal desert-dwelling animal, but exactly what animal it is not clear. And you could draw the same conclusion about the word Lilith. Most scholars, however, including us here at Beneath the Bible, see the Lilith in this passage as a reference to a demon. It seems to be a malevolent supernatural force, which in this case has a female personality. In the context of this passage, Isaiah is describing the desolation of Edom, a rival nation to Judah's southeast. The once populous kingdom will become a desolate place in the wilderness, a place where chaotic, untamed beings dwell. The context of Isaiah 34:14 seems to point to Edom being so thoroughly destroyed that it becomes a place where unclean, malevolent spiritual forces reside. Basically, the whole kingdom will become haunted. It's a place outside of God's well-ordered world. Now, as we'll see, this reading draws on a fair amount of comparative material from outside the Bible, but it also works with only evidence from within the Bible as well. We'll start with the evidence from within the Bible itself. Let's look again at Isaiah 34:14 in these three translations. The creature mentioned just before Lilith is in the second line of the verse, and it's translated as a goat, a satyr, and a wild goat. Now, the Hebrew word for this creature is sa'ir, and with the other creatures in this passage, it isn't obvious exactly what a sa'ir is, although these translations agree that it has goat-like qualities. This is not a hapax legomena, though, and this word shows up elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible. In Leviticus 17:7, the Israelites are forbidden from any longer offering sacrifices to Seirim, which is the plural form of Sa'ir. And from this law, we can know that the Israelites worshipped Seirim at some point in their history. In 2 Chronicles 11:15, Jeroboam I is said to have appointed priests for shrines of Seirim. Here, Seirim are again the objects of sacrifice and worship in Israel. Now, the word literally means hairy, so scholars have interpreted this as a goat demon, or at least a goat-like supernatural being. Back in Isaiah 34:14, a Sa'ir will call out to others, and Lilith will make itself a place to rest. Now, if Sa'ir is elsewhere understood as a supernatural being or class of being that was thought of as goat-like, then it isn't far-fetched to read Lilith as also a supernatural being. With words that only appear once in the Bible, interpretation often relies on context, and here the immediate context includes something like a goat demon. So, what kind of being did the Israelites imagine Lilith to be? Well, it's not clear from Isaiah 34 other than Lilith being associated with the night and with desolate, chaotic landscapes. But if we expand our horizons and look to evidence outside the Bible, there's a lot more we can learn.
Most scholars link the Hebrew name Lilith with the Akkadian words Lilu, Liltu, and Ardat Lili. These are all derived from the Sumerian word Lil. These words generally refer to a type or family of demons or demonesses associated with the wind, particularly with the southwest wind. And this led these creatures to be associated with the ability to fly out of windows or having wings like a bird. The Lilu tend to be male, while the Liltu are female. The Liltu and Ardat Liltu, or Maiden Liltu, were also associated with a frustrated sexuality. The Liltu were like frustrated brides who had never consummated their marriage, and thus were always on the prowl looking for men to seduce, and always quick to fly out the window after seducing them. The Ardat Liltu were believed to be more like young girls, so they were not on the prowl for men in the same sense. They were unable to bear children and could not bear milk. Instead, they took the form of a deceitful wet nurse and produced poison instead of milk. She was also thought to bring impotence on men and sterility on women. By the Middle Babylonian period, Liltu became conflated with another demoness, Lamashtu. Lamashtu was not your average demon. She was the daughter of Anu, one of the chief gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon, so she was almost like a goddess. Here you can see a number of plaques and amulets that depicted Lamashtu. She was depicted as having a lion head, a donkey's teeth, bloody hands, and the feet of Anzu, or a bird. She was often shown suckling either dogs or pigs, and if she wasn't suckling them, she was often associated with them, as well as donkeys. These plaques were meant to drive away Lamashtu. Alternatively, amulets with the demon Pazuzu were meant to drive her away. She was thought to bring all kinds of sickness, but she also had particular animus for women and newborns, which she targeted with miscarriage and what we might call sudden infant death syndrome. She was said to touch a woman's stomach 7 times and thus kill the baby, so driving her off was important for all pregnant women. In Syria, Lilith may also have been feared. The Arslan and Tash amulets have long been interpreted as showing Lilith. A likely reconstruction of the fragmentary text states, "To her that flies in rooms of darkness, pass quickly, quickly, Lilith." That text is associated with this composite figure here. With the head of a human and the body of a lion, it may be identified on this tablet as Lilith. Finally, we want to make a quick note about something that likely does not depict Lilith. This is an artifact called the Bernie relief. Many have identified the female figure in this relief as Lilith, but we disagree with that identification. She is clearly female, she is winged and thus possibly associated with the winds or flying. She has bird legs and so could possibly be identified as a bird. She also has 2 attendant owls. And thinking back to Isaiah 34, it's easy to see how some may identify this figure as Lilith, since Lilith in that passage could be interpreted as a kind of bird, maybe even an owl. While you may see this as a depiction of Lilith, and it's not 100% that it isn't a depiction of Lilith, most scholars think this figure is either Ishtar or Eresh Kigal, the goddess of love and war, or the goddess of the underworld. In sum, the Mesopotamian evidence seems to show that the Hebrew word Lilith is a derivation of the demoness Liltu, Ardat Liltu, and possibly Lamashtu. These demonesses targeted men and were seducers of men, as well as being dangerous to pregnant women and young children. They were associated with the wind and occupied desolate places on the chaotic fringe of the ordered world. And this matches quite well with the context of the words used in Isaiah 34. But this isn't the whole story. The data we've looked at so far are either from the biblical text itself or from older material. Lilith took on a whole life of her own after the Isaiah text was written, and traditions about her grew in Jewish and medieval Christian folklore. This later development further supports the interpretation of Lilith in Isaiah 34 as a supernatural force. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, specifically in the Songs of the Sage in 4Q 510 to 511, it says the instructor proclaimed God's splendor to frighten all the spirits of the destroying angels, spirits of the bastards, demons, Lilith, howlers, and desert dwellers. Now this strengthens our understanding that Isaiah 34 is referring to a particular named supernatural character, because that seems to be how it was understood by the Qumran community, who list Lilith with the howlers and desert dwellers, who also are mentioned in Isaiah 34. In the Babylonian Talmud, a collection of Jewish writings which taught and interpreted matters of Jewish life and law, Lilith appears several times. She is said to have long hair and wings. She is supposedly the mother of other demons, like one named Hermon. And men are warned not to sleep in a house alone, as she may seize them. In Jewish mysticism, specifically Kabbalah as taught in the Zohar, you could recognize Lilith's presence because she was responsible for, and I'll just quote the sources I've read on this, a man's nocturnal emissions. From these she would spawn innumerable demons, and this is likely drawn on Talmudic teaching that after Adam learned he was responsible for death, he kept himself apart from Eve for 130 years. But he, shall we say, accidentally spilled his seed, and from it spawned ghosts, male demons, and night demons. Later traditions further developed the story of Lilith into what may be more familiar to people now, particularly as an icon of the modern feminist movement. From these later traditions, we see stories where Lilith was Adam's first wife, and that she was the grandmother of the devil. The story of Lilith as Adam's first wife comes from the Alphabet of Ben Sirach, which is an anonymous medieval book that is playing off of a well-known Hellenistic text attributed to a Jewish scholar named Ben Sira. And the Alphabet of Ben Sirach is a satirical text that was likely written sometime before 1000 AD. And it's likely drawn on pre-existing traditions around Lilith and just not fabricating them out of whole cloth. For example, the tradition of an earlier wife of Adam is certainly very old, likely drawing from men and women being created on the sixth day in Genesis 1, but Eve was only made from Adam's rib in Genesis 2:22. Some interpreters saw room then for a wife for Adam before Eve. And the Alphabet of Ben Sirach makes this figure, who was already a part of interpreted tradition, into Lilith. The story is pretty interesting and vaguely familiar to lots of people today, so as it's popular within modern feminist literature, so it's worth looking at it in some detail. According to the Alphabet of Ben Sirach, immediately after Adam is made of earth, God made Lilith. And Adam and Lilith immediately began to fight. She said, "I will not lie below," and he said, "I will not lie beneath you, but only on top. For you are fit only to be in the bottom position, while I am to be the superior one." Lilith responded, "We are equal to each other, inasmuch as we are both created from the earth." You can see why Lilith became such a potent figure for women's rights. When Lilith saw this, she pronounced the ineffable name and flew into the air. Adam cries out to God, who sends 3 angels to retrieve her, the names of which appear on amulets to ward off the demoness. Said the Holy One to Adam, "If she agrees to come back, what is made is good. If not, she must permit 100 of her children to die every day." Well, the angels catch up to her, and she refuses to return. She says, "Leave me. I was created only to cause sickness to infants. If the infant is male, I have dominion over him for 8 days after his birth, and if female, for 20 days. When the angels heard Lilith's words, they insisted she go back, but she swore to them by the name of the living and eternal God, "Whenever I see you or your names or your forms in an amulet, I will have no power over that infant." She also agreed to have 100 of her children die every day. Accordingly, every day 100 demons perish, and for the same reason, we write the angels' names on the amulets of young children. Now, when Lilith sees their names, she remembers her oath, and the child recovers. So this story is ideological. It explains why children were given amulets with the names of 3 angels on them, and it is also telling this story to fill in the gaps perceived in the story of Genesis 1 with characters from Jewish folklore. But we should keep in mind that this story, as with many others in the Alphabet of Ben Sirach, is likely satirical. In this story, Adam is weak and ineffectual. Even God seems to have little or no control over Lilith. So we can evaluate all kinds of aspects of this medieval story. We should keep in mind that by the time it was written, the figure of Lilith was already well developed as a kind of night demoness who was sexually frustrated and preyed on men, children, and pregnant women. The narrative in this context is certainly drawing in those pre-existing strands of folklore. While we wrap this part up, it's worth noting that this history of Lilith is woefully incomplete. She appears in other Talmudic references, as well as numerous other Jewish and Christian traditions from the medieval period. There's a mountain of scholarly literature you could dive into if you want to explore all of it. Hopefully we've given you a good overview of who Lilith was thought to be and where the tradition about her may have come from.
There are a few ways that the example of Lilith is instructive to us as we seek to be better readers of the Bible. One is that it helps us understand the presence of hapax legomena in the biblical text and the difficulties that they pose for biblical interpretation. And when a word only appears once in the Bible, it means that interpreters have to look to sources outside the Bible to understand its meaning. Now, sometimes there may not be any extra-biblical sources in the same language to give them clues, and so they have to look for cognates in other ancient languages. The introduction of sources beyond the Bible can make important contributions to understanding the biblical text, but it can also introduce challenges to correct interpretation. Second, the example of Lilith once again demonstrates how the supernatural world of ancient Israel was connected to that of surrounding cultures. The Lilith or Lamashtu figures were well developed in the mythology of other ancient peoples, and they helped to explain otherwise mysterious tragedies like infertility, miscarriage, and sudden infant death. Now, at the same time, this prominent figure from other cultures only gets one obscure reference in the Bible itself. Now, although there is significant later development of the Lilith figure outside the Bible, the biblical authors held this figure to have basically no importance. These maladies related to childbearing may not have been understood to be caused by Yahweh, but they were ultimately under the authority of Yahweh, and there was no need to fear or appease another being in order to prevent them. This leads to a final point, which is that we always need to be careful to separate biblical tradition from other, especially later traditions. Now, there's a wide range of mythology and literary development around the figure of Lilith, but none of it carries the weight of biblical authority. So while studying these traditions is interesting and understanding them can be important, we shouldn't take them as gospel. As followers of Jesus, we can support the dignity and the empowerment of women without elevating a figure to semi-divine status who was basically unimportant to biblical authors. The equality and image-bearing nature of both men and women is a gift from God, and we can freely embrace it as such. Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. Be sure to give this video a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any future videos. If you learned something new today, take a minute to share this video with your friends. And until next time, keep digging.